No bonus, tight budgets, don't take it personally. That's what my boss said, smiling from behind his desk, right after denying the reward I'd earned year after year. I stood there frozen, watching him talk about sacrifice while everything I built kept this company breathing. In that moment, something went quiet inside me. Not anger, not tears, just clarity. I realized they didn't think I'd ever leave. They thought I'd keep fixing what they broke silently. What they never asked was why the system never failed while I was there. If you've ever been undervalued and told to stay grateful, subscribe and tell me your story in the comments. I didn't arrive at that company with ambition to be indispensable. It just happened quietly over time, the way responsibility always seems to land on the person who actually fixes things instead of the ones who talk the loudest. From the outside, my job title sounded ordinary, almost forgettable, but inside those walls, I was the person people went to when the spreadsheets stopped lining up, when deliveries stacked up at the wrong locations, when promises made in boardrooms met reality on the ground. I wasn't flashy about it. I didn't dominate meetings or interrupt people mid-sentence. I listened, absorbed patterns, and solved problems before they grew teeth. Over the years, I learned which routes broke under pressure, which partners always called late on Fridays, which delays could be ignored, and which ones would quietly cascade into disasters by Monday morning. Most of that knowledge never made it into official documents because no one ever asked me to formalize it. They just expected it to work, and it did. Every holiday surge, every unexpected spike, every last-minute change that should have caused chaos somehow smoothed itself out, and leadership praised the strong systems and the solid process maturity without ever questioning who kept stitching it together behind the scenes. I was praised for being reliable, for being calm, for not making waves. That praise never came with visibility or leverage, just more responsibility layered gently on top of what I was already carrying. Over time, people stopped asking if I could handle things and started assuming I always would. New hires were told, if something goes wrong, ask her. Senior managers deferred decisions to me in private, then presented those same decisions as their own in public meetings. When things went right, it was teamwork. When something wobbled, it landed quietly on my desk. I learned to fix issues before they reached leadership, not because I wanted credit, but because I hated watching small problems turn into fires that hurt people who didn't deserve it. Somewhere along the way, my silence became part of the infrastructure. The company didn't just rely on my work, it relied on my restraint. I absorbed pressure so others could look composed. I corrected mistakes so executives could look decisive. Translated chaos into stability and never once asked for applause. The strange thing is, I didn't even realize how much I was holding until I noticed how little anyone seemed to notice me at all. Meetings would end with action items clearly aimed at my workload, yet my name rarely appeared in follow-up emails. Projects I initiated were suddenly described as department-wide efforts once they showed results. When deadlines were met against impossible odds, leadership credited culture and collaboration, as if effort floated in the air without hands guiding it. I told myself this was normal, that this was just how organizations worked, that being trusted mattered more than being seen. I told myself that consistency was its own reward. But that belief required me to ignore a growing imbalance I felt every time I watched people with lighter workloads receive louder praise, bigger titles, and visible rewards for outcomes they barely understood. I wasn't bitter. I was tired in a quiet way that doesn't complain, the kind that shows up when you realize you're being relied on, not because you're valued, but because you're convenient. I had built a reputation for handling pressure without drama, and that reputation followed me everywhere. It became the reason people felt comfortable stacking more weight onto my shoulders without checking whether I could still breathe under it. What no one ever asked was what would happen if I stopped catching the things they dropped. They assumed stability was automatic, that systems ran because systems always had. They didn't see the human judgment layered into every smooth outcome, the late nights spent tracing patterns no one else noticed, the quiet decisions that prevented delays before they ever appeared on reports. I wasn't invisible because I lacked impact. I was invisible because my impact made everything look easy. And when something looks easy long enough, people forget it's being held at all. The meeting was supposed to be routine, the kind you walk into prepared, confident, already knowing the numbers will speak for you. I had rehearsed nothing dramatic, just facts, just results, just 4 straight years of performance that couldn't be argued away without dishonesty. He didn't even look at what I brought. My manager leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, voice already wearing that careful tone people use when they plan to disappoint you and expect gratitude for it. He said the company was being cautious this year, that leadership had agreed everyone needed to tighten belts, and that bonuses weren't aligned with current priorities. He said it slowly, like he was delivering wisdom instead of taking something from me. What made my stomach turn wasn't the denial itself, it was the timing. As he spoke, his desk was cluttered with glossy pages from a luxury catalog, the kind that smells like expensive ink and entitlement. He absent-mindedly flipped through it while explaining. Restraint, circling options with a pen that probably cost more than the raise I was being denied. I stood there holding my evaluation, watching the contradiction unfold in real time. When I asked if this applied across the board, he nodded without hesitation, already looking past me. Of course, he said, as if fairness were implied simply by saying the word everyone. Outside his window, the executive parking row gleamed, new vehicles lined up like trophies. I realized then that everyone didn't include people like me. The humiliation sharpened when he added that familiar phrase, the one meant to keep women manageable. "Don't take this personally," he said. "No need to get emotional." I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't argued. I hadn't done anything emotional at all. But calling it out before it existed gave him control over how the moment would be remembered. I felt something detach inside me. Not anger, not shock, but recognition. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a bad quarter. This was a pattern settling into permanence. He thanked me for being a team player, praised my reliability, and promised we'd revisit the conversation later. Later had already happened too many times. As I stood there nodding out of habit, I noticed how comfortable he was, how certain he seemed that I would absorb this quietly and return to fixing whatever went wrong next. He believed my professionalism was permission. When the meeting ended, he dismissed me with a smile that said the matter was closed. I walked back to my desk feeling smaller, not because I'd been denied money, but because my effort had been reduced to something optional, something nice to have but not worth rewarding. Colleagues passed me in the hallway, laughing about weekend plans, unaware that something fundamental had just shifted. I sat down, opened my email, and stared at the screen without reading a word. That was the moment the insult fully landed. It wasn't the lack of a bonus. It was the certainty in his voice, the assumption that I would accept less again because I always had. He didn't think I had options. He didn't think I would leave. And that belief, more than the money, was the deepest disrespect of all. After that meeting, nothing outwardly changed, which somehow made everything feel worse. The same emails came in, the same questions landed in my inbox, the same unspoken expectation hovered that I would sort things out quietly. What changed was how clearly I started seeing the pattern I'd spent years rationalizing away. Once you notice it, it's impossible to unnotice. In meetings, ideas I introduced gently were met with silence, only to resurface minutes later when repeated louder by someone else and greeted with nods and approval. The room would shift toward them, credit snapping into place like it had always belonged there. I'd sit back and watch it happen, realizing this wasn't coincidence or bad luck. It was a system of attention that rewarded confidence over competence and volume over substance. I began paying closer attention to who was praised and why. The words used were always vague, almost poetic in their emptiness. Leadership potential, strong presence, great energy. No one talked about outcomes or consequences or the long nights required to prevent failure. Those details lived with me, unspoken, invisible, apparently unimportant. When projects succeeded, leadership framed it as collaboration, as if results simply emerged from group harmony rather than from someone doing the unglamorous thinking. When something stalled, the blame never traveled upward. It drifted sideways or downward, settling on whoever could fix it without causing embarrassment. That was usually me. I noticed how often I was asked to step in quietly, off the record, to stabilize situations that others had publicly mishandled. The ask was always framed as trust. You're the only one who can handle this. We rely on you. You're steady. Those words felt flattering until I realized they were also a trap. Being the person who fixes everything makes you indispensable, but it also makes you easy to exploit. I started replaying past moments with new clarity. Performance reviews that praised my attitude more than my results. Promotions that bypassed me with explanations that sounded reasonable until you stack them year after year. Meetings where I was invited not to speak, but to validate decisions already made. I had been trained, subtly and effectively, to believe that patience would be rewarded eventually, that if I just kept my head down, the system would recognize value on its own. What I hadn't accounted for was how comfortable people become when someone else absorbs the friction. They stop seeing it as labor. They start seeing it as natural order. I realized that my restraint had been interpreted as consent. Each time I corrected a mistake without escalating it, each time I let credit slide to avoid conflict, I reinforced the idea that my contribution didn't require acknowledgement. I was helping maintain an illusion of fairness that only benefited those at the top. Friends outside of work would ask why I stayed, why I didn't push harder or make noise. I never had a clean answer. I told them I liked the work, that stability mattered, that change was risky. Those answers sounded responsible, even mature. The truth was quieter and harder to admit. I had internalized the idea that asking for more would somehow make me less respectable, that competence should speak for itself, that being calm was safer than being visible. Those beliefs didn't come from nowhere. They were reinforced every time I watched someone else be rewarded for confidence while I was praised for being agreeable. Over time, I stopped expecting fairness and started managing disappointment instead. That was the most dangerous shift of all. I could feel it in small moments, like when a colleague would ask me to walk them through a solution they'd later present as their own, or when leadership would thank me privately, but never publicly. I'd nod, smile, and tell myself it didn't matter, that I was building something more solid than recognition. But recognition isn't vanity, it's evidence. Without it, effort disappears into the background, unmeasured and therefore easy to deny. One afternoon, sitting in yet another meeting where my role was reduced to support, I felt a strange calm settle in, not resignation, but clarity. I understood then that the issue wasn't that they didn't see my value. It was that the system they operated in didn't reward the kind of value I provided, unless it was wrapped in the right voice and delivered by the right person. Waiting for that to change wasn't loyalty. It was inertia. And inertia only benefits the people already moving forward without you. The moment that stripped away my last doubt didn't come from another meeting or another dismissal. It came quietly on an afternoon when I was looking for something entirely unrelated. I had been asked to pull a routine document from a shared drive, the kind of administrative task no one ever thinks twice about, and as I clicked through folders, one sat there without any protection, labeled plainly enough that curiosity felt almost invited. I hesitated longer than I want to admit, not because I didn't know what it was, but because part of me already understood what opening it would confirm. Inside were spreadsheets laid out with obsessive care, rows and columns detailing compensation decisions in a way that felt intimate, almost confessional. Names appeared, numbers followed, and next to them were short explanations meant to justify each reward. I scanned quickly at first, then slower, my eyes adjusting to what my mind was struggling to accept. Men I worked with, men I corrected quietly, men who relied on my judgment without understanding it, had bonuses attached to their names that dwarfed anything I had ever been offered. The reasons given were vague and flattering, words that sounded impressive without actually meaning anything measurable. Initiative, visibility, leadership presence. I scrolled further, expecting foolishly to eventually find myself somewhere on the list, maybe under review, maybe delayed. My name wasn't there at all. Not listed, not pending, not deferred. It was as if I didn't exist within the framework that decided who deserved investment. What I felt then wasn't rage, it was recognition. A cold, settling certainty that this wasn't a temporary oversight or a budget issue that would resolve with patience. This was deliberate. The system wasn't failing me, it was functioning exactly as designed. I thought back to every assurance I'd been given, every promise to revisit things later, every nod that suggested my time would come. Those moments replayed themselves differently now, stripped of their comfort. They weren't signs of consideration. They were placeholders meant to keep me productive without making commitments. I closed the file and sat back, hands still on the keyboard, aware that I had crossed an invisible line. I couldn't unknow what I'd seen. The story I had told myself about fairness, about eventual recognition, collapsed quietly in that chair. People often ask why someone doesn't confront leadership the moment they see proof like that. The answer is simple and uncomfortable. Confrontation only works when the other side acknowledges the same reality. These people had already built theirs, and I didn't exist in it. Any protest would be absorbed, delayed, reframed, and ultimately dismissed the same way everything else had been. That file wasn't just evidence of inequality, it was an admission of intent. They had decided who mattered, and they had done so without ever expecting me to look. When I stood up from my desk, nothing around me had changed, but I had. I wasn't angry enough to lash out, and I wasn't broken enough to give up. I was clear that staying and hoping was no longer neutral. It was participation in my own erasure. Once the truth settled, my behavior didn't change in any visible way, and that was intentional. I didn't confront anyone, didn't hint at dissatisfaction, didn't suddenly withdraw effort. I understood something important then. The moment people sense resistance, they start protecting themselves, and I wasn't ready to trigger alarms. What I needed wasn't drama, it was options. So I began preparing quietly, the same way I had always worked, carefully and without announcement. I started by taking inventory, not of tasks, but of impact. I asked myself questions no one at work had ever asked me directly. What would break if I wasn't here? Which decisions required judgment rather than procedure? Where did people pause before acting, waiting for confirmation they didn't realize came from me? I paid attention to patterns I had once taken for granted. The late afternoon calls that always landed on my desk, the moments when meetings stalled until I spoke, the subtle relief in people's voices when I said, "I'll take care of it." None of that was documented. None of it appeared on performance dashboards. And yet, it was everywhere. At the same time, I started responding differently to the world outside that office. Messages from industry contacts I had ignored out of loyalty suddenly looked like signals I should have noticed earlier. Invitations to talk, to consult, to share insight were no longer distractions. They were data points. I didn't leap at them. I listened. I asked questions. I learned how my experience was perceived elsewhere, and the contrast was uncomfortable in the best possible way. People didn't talk to me about attitude or patience. They asked about judgment, about how I made decisions under pressure, about what I would do if given authority instead of boundaries. Those conversations didn't inflate my ego. They steadied me. Back at work, I began quietly separating what belonged to the company from what belonged to me. Personal notes were organized, old records were archived, anything that tied my identity too tightly to that place was loosened. I didn't hoard information or sabotage anything. I simply stopped carrying more than I was obligated to carry. That distinction mattered. I continued doing my job well, but I stopped compensating for others without acknowledgement. If something required visibility to fix properly, I let it surface. If a decision needed leadership input, I waited for it. That wasn't revenge. It was alignment. For the first time, my effort matched my role instead of exceeding it to protect people who wouldn't protect me. There were moments when doubt crept in, when the old instinct to smooth things over tugged at me. Years of conditioning don't dissolve overnight, but every time I hesitated, I returned to the evidence I'd seen and the clarity it had brought. This wasn't a phase. It was a boundary I was finally enforcing internally before anyone else needed to see it. I noticed how easily people assumed my presence without checking my capacity, how casually they added expectations to my workload because I had never said no. Preparing to leave wasn't about abandoning responsibility. It was about reclaiming ownership of it. I also prepared emotionally, which mattered more than I expected. I stopped seeking validation from people who had proven they didn't know how to give it. I stopped explaining myself in rooms where understanding was optional. I let silence do its work. As my internal posture changed, I felt something shift. Fear loosened its grip, not because the outcome was guaranteed, but because I knew I was no longer trapped. When an opportunity finally presented itself clearly, I didn't rush toward it. I evaluated it the way I evaluated everything else, methodically, without fantasy. Did it recognize my value explicitly? Did it place authority where responsibility lived? Did it see me as a contributor or a convenience? Those questions guided me more than salary numbers ever had. By the time I reached a decision, it didn't feel like a leap. It felt like the final step in a process that had been unfolding quietly for months. I hadn't announced anything, warned anyone, or asked permission. I had simply prepared myself to stop being the invisible solution to a problem no one wanted to admit existed. The morning I decided to leave didn't feel dramatic, which surprised me. I expected nerves, maybe doubt, maybe the familiar tightness that comes with difficult conversations. Instead, there was a calm I hadn't felt in years, the kind that settles in when a decision has already been made long before the moment arrives. I moved through my routine without rushing, noticing small details I used to overlook, like how quiet the office felt before most people arrived and how predictable everything seemed once you stopped believing it could change. I didn't announce anything. I didn't hint. I walked into my manager's office when his door was open and waited while he finished an email, confident in the assumption that my time could wait. When he finally looked up, I handed him the envelope and said simply that I was resigning, effective immediately. For a second, he stared at me like he hadn't heard correctly. Then came the laugh, short and dismissive, as if this were some kind of joke we were both expected to enjoy. He asked what brought this on, his tone already shifting toward persuasion. I didn't launch into explanations. I didn't list grievances. I told him I had made a decision and that it was final. That was when the temperature changed. He leaned forward, voice sharpening, reminding me of my responsibilities, the team, the timing. He said I couldn't just walk out, as if loyalty could be enforced after years of neglect. I reminded him calmly that my employment terms allowed me to leave and that I had fulfilled every obligation required of me. He tried another approach then, softening his voice, suggesting this was an overreaction, calling it emotional without realizing how predictable that word had become. I listened without interrupting, waiting for him to finish. When he paused, expecting me to back down, I told him I had been patient for years and that patience was no longer a strategy. I placed my badge and keys on his desk, symbols of access I had been trusted with but never respected for. For the first time, he looked uncertain, not angry, not superior, just unsettled. He asked if we could revisit the conversation later, as if time itself could repair what intention never had. I told him we already had, too many times. As I stood to leave, he said my name in a way that sounded like warning rather than appeal. I didn't turn around. Walking back to my desk felt strangely light. I packed the few personal items I kept there, things I had never bothered to display because I never expected to stay long enough to matter. A couple of coworkers glanced up, sensing something was different but not enough to ask. The elevator ride down was quiet, the kind of silence that marks a transition rather than an ending. As the doors closed, my phone buzzed with missed calls I didn't answer. Outside, the air felt different, sharper somehow, as if the world had widened. I didn't feel victorious or relieved. I felt aligned. I had stopped negotiating with people who only valued what I fixed, not who I was. Whatever happened next would no longer be shaped by their assumptions about my willingness to carry what they dropped. The first sign that something was wrong came sooner than I expected, and it arrived without noise. I was settling into a new rhythm, learning faces and routines, when my phone began vibrating in a way it never had before. A steady, insistent pulse that didn't stop even when I turned. It faced down. At first I ignored it, assuming it was the usual follow-up questions that always appeared after I stepped away from a problem. But the calls kept coming, numbers stacking on the screen until it felt less like communication and more like alarm bells. I didn't answer. Whatever they were facing no longer belonged to me. Later, curiosity nudged me just enough to glance at the notifications, and that was when I understood the scale of it. Messages from operations, from supervisors who had never spoken to me directly before, from people who had once assumed I would always be there to translate confusion into action. The tone shifted quickly from polite to urgent to unmistakably panicked. They weren't asking how I was, they were asking what they were missing. The irony was almost painful. For years they hadn't asked that question once. What I learned afterward was that nothing dramatic broke at first. There was no explosion, no single catastrophic mistake to point to. Instead, things simply stopped lining up the way they always had. A scheduled release didn't move. A timing window closed without confirmation. One delay stacked onto another, and then another, until the systems that leadership believed were self-sustaining began revealing how much they depended on judgment rather than automation. People tried to follow procedures, but procedures only work when someone understands when they don't apply. That understanding had lived quietly with me, undocumented and uncredited. Without it, small inconsistencies multiplied. Teams argued over priorities. Decisions stalled, waiting for approval that never came. The calm confidence leadership projected in meetings evaporated as reports turned red and calls went unanswered. What struck me most was how quickly they framed the situation as unexpected. They spoke as if the stability they'd enjoyed had been natural, not maintained, as if smooth operations were the default state of things rather than the result of constant, invisible correction. By the end of the week, the messages had changed again. They weren't asking what was wrong anymore. They were asking me to come back, just temporarily, just to take a look, just to help them stabilize. The language softened, apologies implied but never stated outright. They promised conversations, adjustments, appreciation. I read those words with a strange detachment, recognizing them for what they were. Panic disguised as reconciliation. They weren't responding to my absence as a person. They were responding to the absence of the outcomes I had quietly delivered for years. I thought about all the times I had absorbed pressure so leadership wouldn't have to. All the weekends I'd rearrange plans to prevent issues no one would ever know existed. Now those issues were visible, and the discomfort was immediate. I didn't feel satisfaction watching it unfold. I felt confirmation. Confirmation that my value had never been theoretical. It had been structural. Without my presence, the gaps they had ignored became impossible to deny. Meetings were called, consultants mentioned, blame floated around rooms searching for a place to land. And yet, beneath all of it, there was a simple truth they couldn't escape. Nothing had been sabotaged. Nothing had been taken away. The only change was that I was no longer there to compensate for a system built on assumption rather than respect. When they finally reached out directly, the message was clear enough to hear between the lines. They needed me. Not as a colleague, not as a leader, but as a solution. That distinction mattered. It told me everything I needed to know about why leaving had been the right choice. Absence has a way of revealing what presence concealed. In my case, it revealed how much weight I had been carrying alone, and how fragile things became once that weight was set down. They found me sooner than I expected, not with confidence or authority, but with the quiet urgency of people who had run out of good options. A request came through from someone higher up than my former manager, framed as a meeting, polite on the surface but heavy with implication. I agreed, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to hear how they would explain what had already explained itself. When we sat down, the tone was different from every conversation we'd had before. No lectures, no reminders about loyalty, just carefully chosen words about disruption, impact, and urgency. They spoke as if the situation had appeared overnight, as if years of dependence had not led directly to this moment. I listened without interrupting, noticing how uncomfortable it made them when I didn't rush to reassure or fix anything. They asked if I could step in temporarily, help stabilize things, maybe consult until they sorted out next steps. The offer came wrapped in praise they had never given freely when it mattered. I asked a simple question instead. Why now? The answer, after a pause that said more than words, was honesty edged with fear. Because everything I used to handle quietly was now visible. Because the cost of ignoring it had finally landed on desks that couldn't deflect it anymore. I told them I wasn't available, not angrily, not triumphantly, just clearly. I explained that I had moved on, that my focus was elsewhere, and that returning even briefly would put me back in a position I had worked hard to leave. They tried once more, this time offering recognition, authority, compensation that sounded generous only because it was late. I declined again. Walking out of that meeting felt different from the day I resigned. This time, there was no uncertainty left to carry. I didn't feel like I had proven a point. I felt like I had closed a door that no longer led anywhere I wanted to be. In the weeks that followed, I settled fully into my new role, where my work was discussed openly, and my judgment was trusted without being taken for granted. Problems still existed, but they were addressed collaboratively, without the expectation that one person would absorb the consequences of everyone else's decisions. When I heard updates about my former company, they came secondhand, stripped of drama. Leadership changes, restructuring, losses framed as lessons. None of it surprised me. When you build success on unseen labor and unacknowledged effort, collapse isn't sudden, it's delayed. Looking back, the most powerful moment wasn't when they called asking for help or when the systems faltered. It was earlier, when I chose to stop shrinking my value to fit someone else's comfort. Leaving didn't make me powerful. It revealed the power I had been exercising quietly all along. If you've ever been told to wait your turn while carrying more than your share, understand this. Silence can look like compliance until the day it isn't there anymore. And when it's gone, everything changes. If this story feels familiar, you're not alone. Share your experience in the comments, and if you want more stories like this, subscribe and stay with me. What stays with me isn't the meeting where my bonus was denied or the email silence that followed. It's how much strength I was using long before anyone noticed, and how quietly I learned to hide it. I walked into that office prepared, holding proof of years of work, and walked out realizing preparation alone doesn't protect you if no one intends to listen. The humiliation wasn't loud, it was polite. It sat in phrases like tightening belts and don't take it personally, while glossy pages on his desk reflected a reality I wasn't meant to question. For a long time, I believed patience was maturity. I believed keeping records was just good habits. I believed staying calm meant staying safe. What I didn't understand was that those same traits were the source of my power, not evidence of my weakness. The emails I saved, the patterns I noticed, the quiet way I prepared options without announcing them, those weren't defensive behaviors. They were leverage I didn't yet know how to name. When the system stumbled after I left, it wasn't because I broke anything. It was because I stopped compensating for a culture that confused silence with compliance. The real lesson wasn't that leaving worked. It was that I had been strong the entire time, just invisible to people who benefited from that invisibility. If I could speak to a friend standing in that same hallway, holding a folder no one plans to read, I'd tell her this: your quiet work is still work. Your records matter. Your restraint is not consent. And preparation doesn't mean fear. It means respect for yourself, even when others won't show it. How to get started today. Save proof of your work before you need it. Notice who benefits when you stay silent. Track patterns, not promises. Build options quietly without threats. Trust clarity more than hope. What part of your quiet effort do you think others would miss if it was gone? And if you enjoyed this story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a like, because stories like this are what I'm all about. Thanks for watching.